In 1992, an extraordinary chess battle took place in California. A 68-year-old grandmaster and former world championship contender David Bronstein faced one of the strongest chess engines of that time, Deep Thought. But for Bronstein, this wasn't just a match. It was a fight to preserve the essence of chess. He feared that with the rise of computers, chess was becoming too rational and dry. The game was losing its mystery and beauty. So, Bronstein challenged the cold-blooded, materialistic monster using his greatest weapons: intuition, imagination, risk, and creativity. He eventually lost the match, but he achieved his main goal, demonstrating what imaginative chess looks like and creating several masterpieces. And I'm going to make a series of videos on the most fascinating games from this match. So let's dive into the first one. The engine starts with d4 and Bronstein plays his favorite King's Indian defense: knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6. The engine goes for the most aggressive line, f4, the four pawns attack. White creates a monumental center, but later in the game this center might become a target of attack. Bronstein castles, white develops the king's knight, and black attacks white's center with c5. White crosses the center of the board, increasing his space advantage, putting more pressure on black and squeezing him. Bronstein attacks the center one more time with e6, and after bishop e2 he captures on d5. White, of course, cannot capture with the knight, as he is losing the e4 pawn in this case, so he must capture on d5 with one of his pawns. If he captures with the e-pawn, the pawn would stop controlling the f5 square and black would get a chance to comfortably finish his development with bishop f5, and after white castles, as you see, black is squeezed, and when you are squeezed, it's always a good idea to exchange pieces, so black can play knight e4, which opens the bishop's diagonal and leads to the exchange of the knights, and after knight takes e4 and bishop takes e4, white doesn't have any advantage, the position is absolutely equal. For this reason, instead of capturing with the e-pawn, the engine captures with the c-pawn. Bronstein again attacks the center with rook e8, threatening to capture on e4, that's why the pawn moves forward. The white pawns look dangerous. They have crossed the center of the board and squeeze black. However, after d takes e, f takes e, and knight g4, it turns out that the e5 pawn is attacked 3 times, while it's defended only once. The engine develops the bishop with a tempo, attacking the queen, and after queen b6, besides the e5 pawn, the b2 pawn also falls under attack. But the engine simply castles kingside, finishing its development. Of course, capturing on b2 now doesn't make any sense because black is behind in development, so making another move with the queen would be a mistake. For example, white can play knight b5, creating multiple threats. For this reason, of course, instead of capturing on b2, Bronstein eliminates a much more important central pawn. Knight takes e5, winning a pawn. Knight takes e5 followed. Now black can capture either with the bishop or with the rook. Bronstein goes for rook takes e5, as it comes with a tempo. And the engine defends the bishop with queen d2, also defending the b2 pawn and connecting his rooks. So black is up a pawn. However, for the pawn, white has compensation. He has a much better development. He has developed all his pieces except the rook, while black still hasn't developed his queenside. Besides that, white has a dangerous passed pawn, and white has a simple plan. He's going to play bishop c4 next move, followed by d6, opening the bishop's diagonal, putting pressure on f7, and, which is the most important, after d6, he would threaten to invade with the knight the great central d5 square with a tempo, attacking the black queen. So black must develop his queenside as soon as possible. If he plays knight d7, the knight would stand in front of the light squared bishop, in front of this bishop, closing its diagonal. So first Bronstein develops the bishop, also closing the f-file. And only after bishop c4 he develops the knight. And now, of course, the logical move for white, recommended by Bronstein in his annotations, would have been d6, which would have increased the activity of all white pieces. The light squared bishop's diagonal would open, the dark squared bishop might invade e7, defending the important pawn, and white would threaten knight d5. It's true, black can prevent the invasion of the knight on d5 by playing bishop e6. Now knight d5 would be a blunder, because instead of capturing the knight with the bishop, black has nice tactics. He would capture the knight with the rook, moving the rook away from e5, from the diagonal of the bishop, and after bishop takes d5, instead of capturing right away, black would make an in-between move, check, breaking the communication between the white queen and the bishop, and only then capturing on d5, and for the rook black has two minor pieces and an absolutely winning position. So after d6 and bishop e6, instead of invading the d5 square, white can exchange the bishops. After rook takes e6, black is ready to capture on d6, but white can defend the pawn, and again the position would remain more or less equal. Black is up a pawn, but for the pawn white has some compensation. He has a dangerous passed pawn and pressure on the f-file. But in our actual game, instead of pushing the d-pawn forward, the engine makes a move which surprised Bronstein. At first sight, this move doesn't make any sense. The engine plays rook c1. Bronstein writes that this move is simply a loss of a tempo. However, the engine has a point. Rook c1 is actually a waiting move. The engine is waiting for black to make the most natural move. And indeed, Bronstein makes it. His only undeveloped piece is the rook, so he plays rook e8. Now he completely dominates the only open e-file. But rook e8 was exactly what the engine was waiting for. Now that the black rook, this rook, is placed on e8, this square is inaccessible for the e5 rook. And it turns out that after bishop f4, white is winning the exchange, as there are no squares for this rook to retreat. Indeed, all these squares are controlled by white. The only square is e7, but it makes no sense to retreat there, because that would let white push the pawn forward with a tempo, activating all his pieces with a tempo, and still the rook must move away, and still the exchange would be lost. But Bronstein writes in his annotations that the engine doesn't realize that his bishop is actually stronger than the rook. So he makes, this time Bronstein makes a semi-waiting move, a6. Actually, it's not a completely waiting move. It's a useful move, taking the b5 square under control, preventing the white pieces from moving there, and letting his opponent capture on e5. So white has won the exchange. But after knight takes e5, we can see that black has very good compensation for the exchange. So he has a pawn, he has the advantage of two bishops, and the dark squares on white's territory are weakened, and white doesn't have the dark squared bishop anymore to defend these squares, while black still has the dark squared bishop. So Bronstein will try to exploit this weakness. Besides that, knight takes e5 comes with a tempo. Black is threatening to capture the bishop. Of course, white could have retreated the bishop, but probably the engine disliked that black can play c4 check with a tempo, and after the king moves, black can move away the queen, pushing the b pawn forward, and his pawn majority on the queen side would start its advance. So instead of retreating the bishop to e2, the engine defends the bishop indirectly. It plays rook e1, pinning the knight. Now black, of course, cannot capture, as the e8 rook would fall. But Bronstein writes in his annotations that it would be better to move another rook to e1, as the f1 rook is already quite active on the f-file, while the c1 rook isn't doing much. But the engine has its own logic. By playing rook e1, Besides pinning the knight, he also vacates the f1 square for the bishop. And we have reached our first critical position. So black is down the exchange. That means he must play energetically and imaginatively. So you can pause the video and try to find Bronstein's plan and his next two moves. So white's kingside is weakened. Most of his pieces are placed on the queenside, so Bronstein tries to initiate an attack on the white king. In order to do it, he reroutes his queen from the queenside to the kingside, and he does that with a tempo, queen d8, defending the rook. That means the knight is unpinned and black is ready to capture the bishop. So white must spend a tempo to save the bishop. The engine plays bishop f1, and now the queen is rerouted to the kingside. Queen h4, a beautiful maneuver of the queen. Just in two moves, the queen is rerouted to the kingside. And now Bronstein's intentions are clear. His knight is again pinned, but he is going to unpin the knight by playing rook d8, followed by deadly knight g4, which would threaten checkmate on h2. Besides that, after the knight moves away from e5, black would also threaten bishop d4 check. But instead of taking the immediate measures against these terrible threats, the engine makes another move which at first sight doesn't make any sense. It moves the rook back to its initial square. Bronstein writes in his annotations that this rook surprises him for the second time during the game, and only later he realized what computer's idea is by playing rook a1. So computer was afraid of bishop h6. By playing queen h4, Bronstein has also taken the h6 square under control. So computer thought that black was going to play bishop h6, getting back the exchange, remaining with an extra pawn. But Bronstein writes that it wouldn't even cross his mind to exchange his great bishop for the useless c1 rook. But you might wonder why to parry the threat of bishop h6, which Bronstein wasn't actually going to execute, but anyways, why instead of moving the rook to its initial square, white didn't play rook d1, which looks more natural. Indeed, it was possible, but probably the engine was afraid of bishop g4, which would again attack the rook. And if white makes the obvious move, bishop e2, he is losing, because the bishop stands in the rook's way, the rook doesn't control the e3 square anymore, and black can play bishop h6, not to win the exchange, but to initiate a deadly attack, to kick the queen out of d2, and after she moves, the bishop can invade e3. Not right away. First, black must play knight f3 check, opening the e-file, so white cannot capture with the bishop, as he would get checkmated in two moves, so he must capture with a pawn. His kingside is demolished, and only now the bishop invades e3 with a check, followed by bishop f4, threatening checkmate on h2. In order to defend against the checkmate, white must move the bishop away from the queen's way, but then f3 would fall, followed by rook takes e1. Black is winning. So, probably for this reason, instead of natural rook d1, the engine plays rook a1. And the knight is still pinned. Bronstein would love to play knight g4, but it doesn't work, so first he unpins the knight. And now he is ready to play knight g4, but the engine prevents it by playing h3. And we have reached another critical position. So, how should black continue his attack? You can pause the video and try to find Bronstein's idea. So he still plays knight g4, opening the bishop's diagonal and forcing his opponent to accept the sacrifice, because if white doesn't capture the knight, then after bishop d4 check, king h1, black would play queen g3, threatening checkmate in 1, So after queen g3, white would be forced to capture the knight to prevent checkmate on h2, but that would open the h-file, and from g3 the black queen would return to h4 with checkmate. So white is forced to capture the knight. Now he is up a whole rook. However, now we can see another idea behind the knight sacrifice. The h-file is open, and after bishop d4 check, the white king doesn't have any moves. So the only move is rook e3. We have reached another critical position. What should black do next? He is down a whole rook. Capturing on e3, of course, doesn't make any sense, exchanging the great bishop for the rook, after which black wouldn't have sufficient attacking resources, his attack would fade away, and white would remain with an extra piece, so it doesn't work. Black must find something else. You can pause the video and try to find Bronstein's idea. So the rook is pinned, and at first sight black must attack the pinned piece one more time with rook e8, threatening to capture, winning the queen. And indeed, if white defends his rook by playing rook e1, black has a beautiful tactical blow. Queen takes e1, and after queen takes e1, rook takes e3, black is threatening to win the queen with the discovered check, and there is nothing white can do to save the queen. If she moves too far away, black can even checkmate in one move. So the best move for white would be queen f2 to close the bishop's diagonal, but in this case black captures on c3, the queen is pinned, she is lost, and after b takes c, bishop takes f2 check, black transitions into a winning bishop endgame with two extra pawns. However, after rook e8, which looks like the strong move, instead of defending the rook with rook e1, white has another idea. There is a pawn on g4, which breaks communication between the black queen and the bishop. So white can sacrifice the queen. Queen takes d4, unpinning his rook. Black cannot capture with the queen to maintain the pin. He must capture with a pawn, after which the rook is unpinned. It captures on e8 with a check, with a tempo. Then white captures the bishop, and after d takes c, b takes c, it turns out that white has big material advantage. He has two rooks and a bishop for the queen. So natural move rook e8 doesn't work. Instead of this, Bronstein plays bishop takes g4. He had to foresee all this before sacrificing the knight on g4 a couple of moves ago. So what's the idea behind bishop g4? First, of course, saving the attacked bishop. The second idea is to move away from f5, opening way for the black pawn. Black is threatening f5, f4, attacking the rook, the pinned rook, after which black would get his rook back and would get an absolutely winning position. He would get material advantage and his attack would continue. And another idea behind bishop g4 is to control this diagonal, to restrict the knight. So if, for example, white plays knight e2, hoping to exchange this great bishop to unpin his rook, black, of course, would simply capture it. And after bishop takes e2, this time, now that there is no white pawn on g4, there is a communication. The communication is restored between the queen and the bishop. This time, black can play rook e8 and the game is over, because there is no queen d4, because instead of capturing with the pawn, of course, black captures with the queen and the rook is still pinned. For this reason, after bishop takes g4, as f5, f4 is threatened, and there isn't much white can do about it. It isn't clear how white can unpin his rook, as the king doesn't have any moves. The engine plays queen f2 to exchange the queens. Bronstein exchanges the queens. Queen takes f2 check. King takes f2, and this time rook e8, threatening to get his rook back. If white plays rook e1, black plays f5, threatening f4, and there isn't anything white can do to parry. There is nothing white can do to parry this threat. For example, if he plays g3, then black renews the threat with g5. Next move he will play f4. And if he plays knight d1 to defend his rook, again you can see the power of this bishop, so black would simply exchange and then capture on e3. For this reason, the engine plays king g3, unpinning his rook and attacking the bishop in his turn. Bronstein captures on e3 and king takes g4 follows. So we have reached another critical position. It turns out that white is still up a piece. For the piece, black has only 2 pawns. So what should black do next? Now it's time to weave a mating net around the white king. The black rook is cutting him on the 3rd rank. The pawn controls these squares, so the best move for black would be bishop e5, taking under control this diagonal and in particular the f4 square, preventing the white king from escaping. And after bishop e5, black would create a terrible threat of checkmate in 5 moves. Just to illustrate this threat, let's say if white makes the most natural move, rook d1, black plays f5 check, the king cannot move to h4 because of bishop f6 checkmate, so the only move would be king g5, but king g7 would follow, and there is nothing white can do to stop h6. After that, the king would get checkmated. For example, after d6, h6 check, king h4, bishop f6, checkmate. But unfortunately, Bronstein, as he writes in his annotations, he has been dominating the dark squares for such a long time that he completely forgot about their significance. So he forgot that the white king can escape via f4, and instead of bishop e5, he started playing on the light squares. He plays f5 check. But this move is a mistake because now the king escapes the mating net. King f4 follows. Bronstein still tries to checkmate the enemy king. He plays king f7, threatening king f6, followed by g5 checkmate. But the engine prevents it with a strong move d6, vacating the d5 square for the knight. Now king f6 of course runs into knight d5 check. With a fork, white is winning the rook. Besides that, white is threatening d7, threatening to promote. So after d7, black would be forced to play king e7 to stop the pawn, but again knight d5 check would win the rook. For this reason, to stop the pawn, Bronstein plays king e6. Rook d1 follows. Now it was better for black to capture on d6, letting go of his dreams about checkmating the white king, after which the position would have remained more or less equal. For the piece, black would have had 3 pawns. But instead of capturing on d6, Bronstein still thinks about checkmating the king. He plays h6, threatening checkmate in 1. But this move was a mistake because bishop c4 check follows. Now again king f6 runs into knight d5 check with a fork, so the king must capture on d6. He doesn't defend the f5 pawn anymore, so g5 wouldn't be checkmate, and the bishop attacks the g6 pawn. The pawn moves forward and the f5 pawn falls. But Bronstein doesn't give up. He still has pawn majority on the queen side. So he pushes the pawn forward, b5. Knight e4 check follows, however. King e7 attacking the bishop, and the bishop moves to d5. So now it makes no sense to capture on b2 because the bishop is greatly placed in the center of the board, and after bishop takes b2, the c5 pawn would fall, after which a6 would fall under attack. white is ready to invade g6 and h6 would also fall. For this reason, instead of capturing on b2, Bronstein keeps his great centralized bishop on d4 and invades the second rank, attacking both pawns with the rook. But the engine makes another strong move, b4. The pawn is untouchable, of course, as the bishop in this case would fall, and white is threatening to capture on c5, and there is nothing black can do about it. For example, if he captures on g2, white would capture on c5. Now the bishop is under attack, black must spend a tempo to save it, moving it away from d4, and it turns out that the black king would get checkmated. After bishop e6, there is nothing black can do to stop the invasion of the white rook to the 7th rank. And let's say after a5, rook d7 check, king f8, rook f7 check. If the king moves to e8, he gets checkmated in 2 moves, and if he moves to g8, after king g6, there is nothing black can do to prevent the white rook from moving away with the discovered check and checkmate next move. For this reason, after computer's strong move b4, Bronstein resigned. Next week, we'll analyze another game from this match. For now, I recommend watching Bronstein's romantic masterpiece against another engine, Fidelity. But first, I'd be grateful if you like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.